129 men sailed into the Arctic. They did not believe they were walking into a grave. They believed they were entering history. They were officers, sailors, engineers, surgeons, and specialists. Men selected carefully by the most powerful navy on Earth. Men trained to endure cold, isolation, and hardship. Their ships were reinforced with iron. Their holds were filled with food, coal, tools, and scientific instruments. They carried books, musical instruments, and letters from home. This was not desperation. This was confidence. And yet, none of them would return. No survivor would ever describe the final days. No journal would record the last decisions. No official report would explain how one of the greatest expeditions of the 19th century collapsed into silence. What remains is one of history's most haunting mysteries. This is the story of the Franklin expedition. In the early 1800s, the Arctic was not seen as a place of death. It was seen as a challenge. European empires believed that the frozen north concealed a prize of enormous value, the Northwest Passage, a sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic. Whoever found it would control global trade. Britain, at the height of its naval power, was determined to succeed where others had failed. Decades of attempts had already ended in hardship, starvation, and retreat. But each failure only sharpened the obsession. By 1845, British naval technology had advanced. Steam power supplemented sails. Navigation instruments were more precise. Food preservation had improved. The Arctic, it was believed, could finally be conquered. The Royal Navy chose Sir John Franklin to lead the expedition. Franklin was not reckless. He was cautious, experienced, and methodical. He had already survived earlier Arctic journeys that pushed men to the brink of death. He understood cold. He understood leadership under pressure. At nearly 60 years old, Franklin was no longer young, but he was trusted. 2 ships were prepared for the journey: HMS Erebus, HMS Terror. Their names alone suggested endurance. Originally built for war, the ships were modified for ice. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plating. Steam engines were installed to assist movement through frozen waters. They carried enough provisions to last several years. Food, coal, medical supplies, everything, it seemed, had been planned. On the 19th of May, 1845, the expedition departed from England. Families watched from shore. Letters were waved. No one imagined this would be a final farewell. For a time, the journey unfolded exactly as expected. The expedition was seen by whaling ships in Baffin Bay. Crew members were described as healthy and optimistic. These sightings would become the last confirmed contact with the Franklin expedition. After that, the Arctic closed around them. As the ships pushed westward, ice thickened. Channels narrowed. The window for safe passage shortened. By September of 1846, both ships became trapped in pack ice near King William Island. At first, this was not considered catastrophic. Arctic expeditions often overwintered in ice. The ships were designed to endure it. The crew settled in to wait. But waiting in the Arctic is not passive. The darkness deepens. The cold intensifies, and time stretches unnaturally. For months, the sun never rose. The temperature dropped to levels that froze exposed skin in minutes. Inside the ships, daily routines were maintained to preserve morale. Meals were served. Equipment was maintained. Men read books and wrote letters they hoped to send one day. But beneath the routine, conditions slowly worsened. The ice did not loosen with spring. It held firm. Another winter came. Supplies were consumed. Coal was burned. Men weakened. And somewhere during this prolonged imprisonment, the expedition crossed an invisible threshold from control to desperation. Years passed with no word from Franklin. In Britain, concern grew into alarm. Search expeditions were launched in every direction. Ships scoured coastlines. Rewards were offered for information. Nothing was found. For a long time, the Arctic revealed nothing. Then, slowly, fragments emerged. A metal note was discovered inside a stone cairn. It contained a brief message. The ships had been trapped since 1846. Sir John Franklin had died in June of 1847. At the time the note was first written, the crew was still alive. But later, a second message was added. It was shorter, more urgent. The ships had been abandoned. This single line changed everything. Abandoning a ship in the Arctic is a decision of last resort. It means that staying guarantees death. It means that the ice has won. What happened after the ships were abandoned is reconstructed from fragments, broken tools, discarded equipment. Human remains are scattered across the frozen landscape. Searchers began to find skeletons along routes leading south. Some lay alone. Some were found in small groups. The pattern suggested exhaustion, collapse, men carrying heavy loads far beyond what their bodies could endure. Evidence of starvation was present, but there was something worse. Marks on bones, cuts consistent with deliberate removal of flesh. The conclusion was unavoidable. Near the end, some of the crew resorted to cannibalism. This revelation was deeply unsettling to Victorian society. The Royal Navy resisted it for years. But physical evidence does not bend to pride. The Franklin expedition did not end in a single disaster. It disintegrated slowly, under cold, under hunger, under isolation. Modern analysis has uncovered additional factors. The expedition's canned food, sealed with lead solder, likely poisoned the crew over time. Lead poisoning causes confusion, weakness, and impaired judgment. Scurvy may have further weakened them. Together, these conditions would have destroyed even the strongest men. Leadership faltered as officers died. Discipline eroded. Decisions became harder. The march south was not a plan for success. It was a gamble against certainty. And the Arctic does not reward gambles. Even today, questions remain unanswered. Why did the ice hold for so long? Could a different route have saved them? Did they wait too long to abandon the ships? We will never know. What we do know is this: 129 men entered the Arctic with confidence. The Arctic did not give them a second chance. And whatever happened in those final months was never meant to be witnessed, because no one survived to tell it. When the decision was made to abandon the ships, the Franklin expedition had already crossed the point of no return. Leaving Erebus in terror was not a strategic move. It was a surrender. Those ships had been the last barrier between the men and the Arctic. Inside them, there was shelter, structure, a sense of order. Outside waited wind, darkness, and endless white. The decision tells us something critical. Conditions aboard the ships had become worse than what awaited them on foot. This means food was running low, fuel was nearly gone, illness had spread, and morale had collapsed. The surviving men gathered what they could carry. Boats were dragged across the ice. Supplies were loaded onto sledges. Personal belongings were discarded. Many of these items would later be found scattered along the route south. Silverware, books, cooking tools, objects that once represented civilization, abandoned in the snow. The men began to walk. The route they chose followed the western coast of King William Island. The plan, as far as it can be reconstructed, was to reach the mainland and travel south toward known trading posts. On maps, the distance does not look impossible. On the ground, it was brutal. The terrain was uneven. Ice shifted constantly. Temperatures remained deadly. Each man carried a weight far beyond what weakened bodies could sustain. Lead poisoning had likely already impaired coordination and judgment. Scurvy weakened muscles and slowed healing. Hunger hollowed them from the inside. Progress would have been painfully slow. Men began to fall behind. Some collapsed and never rose again. Others pressed on, knowing that stopping meant death. This was not a march of confidence. It was a slow disintegration. As years passed, search expeditions found disturbing traces, skeletons lying face down, as if men had collapsed mid-step, bones scattered by animals, and sometimes small groups. Evidence suggested that some men stayed together to the end, that even in desperation, companionship mattered. The Arctic does not care about dignity, but humans do. Perhaps the most important clues came not from British searchers, but from the Inuit. For generations, Inuit communities had lived in the Arctic and survived where others failed. They understood the land, they understood ice, and they remembered. In the years following the Franklin expedition's disappearance, Inuit hunters reported encounters with starving white men dragging boats across the ice. They spoke of abandoned ships. They spoke of bodies. They spoke of men who had clearly been suffering. These accounts were initially dismissed by European officials. Victorian Britain did not trust indigenous testimony. This was a mistake. Modern researchers now recognize that Inuit oral history preserved crucial details that aligned with physical evidence found decades later. The Franklin crew had been seen moving south. They had been seen failing. One particularly chilling account described a group of men collapsing from exhaustion. Another spoke of bodies found in unnatural positions. These were not stories meant to shock. They were observations. And they matched what searchers would later discover. The Arctic had not erased the expedition completely. It had scattered it. As evidence accumulated, a grim picture emerged. The expedition had not ended in a single moment. There was no final stand, no heroic last battle against nature. Instead, there was a slow erosion of strength, of order, of hope. As officers died, command structures weakened. Decisions became inconsistent. The group fractured. Some likely believed they could reach safety faster by traveling light. Others may have refused to abandon certain supplies. These disagreements would have cost time, and time was something they no longer had. The discovery of cut marks on bones forced historians to confront an uncomfortable truth: cannibalism. For Victorian society, this was unthinkable. The Franklin expedition was meant to represent British discipline and moral superiority. The idea that its members could resort to such acts was deeply disturbing. For years, the evidence was denied. But denial does not change reality. In extreme starvation, the human body seeks survival above all else. Cannibalism is not a moral failure. It is a biological one. It means every other option is gone. The presence of these marks tells us that the final phase of the expedition was unimaginably desperate. Men were dying not just from cold, but from hunger so severe that it erased taboo. And yet, even in this collapse, there are signs of restraint. The evidence does not suggest chaos. It suggests grim necessity. This distinction matters because it shows that the men did not abandon their humanity. They were pushed beyond it. One question continues to haunt historians. Why did they wait so long to abandon the ships? It is possible that Franklin and his officers believed rescue would come. After all, the Royal Navy was actively searching. But the Arctic is vast, and rescue ships could not penetrate ice that held fast year after year. By the time the decision was made, it may have already been too late. Another question remains unresolved. Why did they choose that particular route? Maps of the time were incomplete. Some passages were believed to exist where none did. Others were impassable without local knowledge. The Franklin expedition had technology, but it lacked understanding. The Inuit had survived the Arctic for centuries. They traveled light. They adapted. The British expedition tried to bring Europe with them. This may have been their greatest mistake. As the years passed, Britain continued to search. Dozens of expeditions combed the Arctic. Each found fragments. None found survivors. Gradually, hope faded. The Franklin expedition became legend, a warning, and a symbol. What makes this story so unsettling is not just the scale of loss. It is the contrast between preparation and outcome. This was not ignorance. This was overconfidence. The belief that technology could overcome environment, that planning could defeat nature. The Arctic answered with silence. Modern science has added new layers to the story. Analysis of bones confirmed lead exposure. Examination of ship remains revealed how tightly ice had held them. Computer models showed that the conditions during those years were among the harshest on record. The expedition did not fail because of one error. It failed because many small disadvantages aligned. Bad timing, unforgiving weather, slow ice movement, and once momentum was lost, recovery was impossible. By the time the last men collapsed on the ice, the world had already moved on. Britain would never hear their voices. Their story would be pieced together by strangers, from bones, from tools, from silence. The Arctic does not preserve explanations. It preserves remains. And yet, the Franklin expedition continues to resonate because it reveals something deeply human: ambition, confidence, and vulnerability. It shows that even the most powerful institutions can misjudge nature. That technology can fail, and that survival is never guaranteed. By the time the last phase of the expedition began, survival was no longer the objective. Endurance was. The remaining men were no longer thinking in terms of reaching safety weeks or months ahead. They were thinking in hours, in moments. Every step forward required more energy than their bodies could produce. Starvation does not arrive suddenly. It erodes. First, strength disappears, then clarity, then the ability to feel pain normally. Cold accelerates this process. In the Arctic, hunger and cold do not compete. They work together. Men weakened by starvation lose the ability to regulate body temperature. Men suffering from hypothermia lose the ability to think clearly. It is a cycle that feeds on itself, and once it begins, it is almost impossible to reverse. The evidence left behind suggests that the group fragmented, not in chaos, but gradually. Some men collapsed early, others continued. This was not cruelty, it was a necessity. Stopping to help one man often meant condemning two. In such conditions, every choice is wrong. Search teams later found remains spread across miles of frozen terrain, not clustered, not organized. This distribution tells us that the group was not moving as a single unit by the end. Some likely believed they could move faster alone. Others stayed together for warmth and support. None of these strategies worked. The most difficult evidence for historians to confront came from the bones themselves. Careful examination revealed cut marks, not random damage, not animal scavenging, deliberate cuts made with tools. In some cases, marrow had been extracted. This detail is important. Marrow is one of the last remaining sources of nutrition in a starved body. Extracting it requires knowledge and desperation. The presence of these marks does not mean chaos overtook the group. It means hunger became absolute. This was not a failure of character. It was the final stage of starvation. In extreme environments, the body overrides culture. For decades, this aspect of the expedition was rejected. Victorian society could not accept it. The men of the Royal Navy were symbols of discipline and order, but history does not preserve dignity. It preserves truth. And the truth, uncovered slowly and reluctantly, revealed how completely the expedition had collapsed, not because the men were weak, but because the environment was absolute. As more search expeditions entered the Arctic, the Franklin mystery began to reshape exploration itself. Searchers learned from failure. They adopted Inuit techniques. They traveled lighter. They used local clothing. They adapted. And in doing so, they uncovered more fragments, cooking pots, uniform buttons, scraps of paper. Each discovery added detail, but never clarity. The expedition had not left a narrative, it had left debris. One of the most haunting discoveries was a boat found mounted on a sledge. Inside were skeletons. The boat was packed with objects that made no sense for survival. Silverware, books, personal effects. Why carry such items while starving? This detail reveals something crucial. The men were not thinking clearly. They were holding on to symbols of normal life, of civilization, of identity. When everything else was stripped away, these objects represented who they once were. In carrying them, they were carrying memory. And memory weighs more than food. As the years passed, the Franklin expedition transformed from a rescue mission into a lesson. A warning written in ice. It demonstrated that preparation without adaptability is fragile. That technology without local knowledge is incomplete. That nature does not respond to authority. The Arctic had not acted with malice. It had acted with indifference, and that indifference proved fatal. In the 20th century, scientific advances allowed historians to revisit the case with new tools. Bone samples confirmed lead exposure, not from environmental contamination, but from the expedition's own supplies. The canned food that was meant to preserve life had slowly poisoned the men. Lead affects the nervous system. It dulls reflexes, impairs judgment, weakens the body. Combined with malnutrition and cold, it would have been devastating. The expedition was not just battling the environment, it was battling itself. The leadership structure also played a role. Sir John Franklin's death early in the crisis removed a stabilizing force. Subsequent commanders inherited an impossible situation. Every decision carried risk. Stay with the ships and starve. Leave and face exposure. There was no correct choice, only degrees of failure. By the late 1800s, official searches ended. Britain accepted that there were no survivors. The Arctic claimed the expedition, but it did not erase it. More than a century later, modern researchers returned, not to rescue, but to understand. Using sonar, underwater vehicles, and satellite data, search teams focused on areas long described in Inuit accounts. These oral histories, once dismissed, became the key. And then, finally, something extraordinary happened. A ship was found. Resting beneath icy waters lay the remains of one of the expedition vessels, preserved by cold, protected by darkness. It was intact, silent. A second ship would be found 2 years later. Together, they confirmed much of what had been theorized. The ships had not been destroyed by a single catastrophe. They had been imprisoned, locked in ice, until the men inside could no longer endure. Yet even these discoveries did not provide closure. The ships did not contain final journals, no confessions, no explanations. The Arctic had allowed the world to find the bodies, but not the thoughts. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Franklin expedition. We know what happened, but we do not know how it felt. We do not know the conversations, the doubts, the arguments, the final decisions. History ends at the edge of survival, and beyond that edge, silence takes over. The Franklin expedition stands today not as a story of foolishness, but of limits. Limits of technology, limits of planning, limits of human endurance. It reminds us that exploration is not conquest. It is negotiation. And sometimes, the environment refuses to negotiate. When the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were finally located beneath Arctic waters, the world expected answers. After more than a century of speculation, it felt as though the final chapter might at last be revealed. But the ships were silent. Cold, darkness, and time had preserved their shapes, but not their thoughts. No final journals were recovered. No detailed logs describing the last days. No explanation written in desperation. The Arctic had given up the bodies. It refused to give up the story. This absence is what makes the Franklin expedition so powerful. We are not left with a heroic ending. There is no final speech, no moment of triumph or clarity. Instead, there is a slow fading. Men growing weaker, supplies dwindling, decisions becoming harder. The expedition did not end with drama. It ended with exhaustion. Modern researchers often describe the Franklin expedition not as a failure of courage, but as a failure of assumptions. British planners believed technology would compensate for environment. They believed iron hulls, steam engines, and preserved food would make the Arctic manageable. But the Arctic does not reward preparation alone. It rewards adaptation. The Inuits survived because they listened to the land. They moved with it. They accepted its limits. The Franklin expedition tried to impose order on chaos, and chaos responded with silence. One of the most unsettling realizations is how close the expedition may have come to survival. Evidence suggests that if the men had reached certain trading posts, or if they had abandoned the ships earlier, or if ice conditions had shifted slightly, history might remember the expedition very differently. But exploration is not measured in almost. The Arctic does not acknowledge intention, only outcome. What the Franklin expedition ultimately teaches us is uncomfortable. It reveals that intelligence does not guarantee wisdom, that preparation does not ensure safety, and that nature remains indifferent to ambition. These men were not foolish. They were not careless. They were human, and that was enough. In the years following the discovery of the ships, the story of the Franklin expedition began to change. It was no longer framed as a mystery to be solved. It became a warning to be understood. Modern Arctic expeditions study Franklin's mistakes. They travel lighter. They rely on local knowledge. They respect environmental limits. The expedition's failure reshaped exploration philosophy. Its loss saved lives. And yet, despite all we now know, the story continues to unsettle us because it is not ancient. It is modern enough to feel familiar. These were men with technology, with planning, with confidence. They believed they understood the world, and then the world proved them wrong. The Franklin expedition does not haunt us because it is strange. It haunts us because it is believable. Because under the right conditions, many of us would have made the same decisions. Wait a little longer. Carry a little more. Trust preparation a little too much. The line between control and collapse is thinner than we like to admit. Some stories fade with time. This one has grown sharper because it asks a question that history rarely answers clearly. At what point does perseverance become refusal to adapt? And how do you recognize that moment? Before it is too late? The men of the Franklin expedition entered the Arctic believing they were writing history. They did, but not in the way they expected. Their legacy is not a route discovered, but a limit revealed. A reminder that exploration demands humility, and that some places cannot be conquered, only respected. Today, the Arctic remains dangerous. Ice still shifts without warning. Storms still erase trails. Cold still overwhelms planning. The difference is that we now listen more carefully, because once 129 men entered the ice, and not a single one returned. In the next episode, we will explore another real journey where preparation met the unknown. A place where records end suddenly, evidence stops without explanation, and history leaves us standing at the edge of silence once again. Because some expeditions do not fail loudly, they simply disappear. This is Hidden Past.